February 12, 1977, Boston's Dorchester neighborhood, Massachusetts. A black sedan glides down an empty street. The night is bitter, the air sharp. Streetlights flicker against wet asphalt. Inside, a man sits alone, hands clenched, eyes scanning every shadow. He is Mick Ricci, the quiet operator of Boston's most feared syndicate crew. At 11:42 p.m., a single gunshot cracks. It echoes off brick row houses. Ricci slumps forward. No one sees the killer. No one calls the police. For decades, Ricci had been untouchable, Lansky's right-hand man, a shadow in the world of illicit casinos, numbers rackets, and protection schemes. But the reason for his end is not what anyone expected. It wasn't a turf war. It wasn't street vengeance. It was a ledger, a document linking Boston politics to mob-controlled gambling profits. The wrong ledger, seen by the wrong eyes. In less than a moment, the man who ran Lansky's largest syndicate crew for 20 years vanished. And the network he commanded, quiet, efficient, deadly, would begin to unravel. The story that follows is one of loyalty, betrayal, and the dangerous intersections of power, politics, and organized crime. Boston, 1935. Dorchester, a neighborhood of narrow streets, brick row houses, and the persistent hum of industry. Smokestacks from nearby factories etched the skyline. The Great Depression had ended, but its shadow lingered, shaping childhoods with hunger, ambition, and fear. Mick Ricci was born here, the eldest of four, in a family that balanced dignity with necessity. His father worked long shifts at the shipyards, his hands permanently scarred, his temper volatile. His mother ran the household with quiet authority, instilling lessons of survival and cunning. From the start, Mick learned early that power, even small, was survival. Respect wasn't given, it was earned. School offered little refuge. Classrooms were crowded, discipline inconsistent. Mick was clever, observant, a boy who noticed patterns where others saw chaos. He understood people early, how to read fear, ambition, and opportunity. Friends came and went, many swallowed by gangs, others by the law. Mick gravitated towards those who understood leverage. He was not impulsive, he was patient, calculating. By his teenage years, Mick was working small jobs, running errands, collecting debts for local bookmakers, shadowing men older and wiser in the world of illicit business. He watched the police, the politicians, and the older operators of Boston's underground. Every gesture, every bribe, every whispered threat was a lesson.
It was here, in Dorchester's back alleys and smoky pool halls, that Mick learned two truths that would define him. Loyalty could be a weapon, and knowledge could be more lethal than any gun. But Ricci was not merely a product of his environment. He possessed a quiet charisma. People trusted him. They confided in him. Even those who feared him respected the subtle code he carried, a code that blurred morality, survival, and ambition into a single unyielding directive: control what you can and anticipate the rest. He was ambitious, but not reckless, calculating, but human, a man shaped equally by his environment and by choices only he could make. And it was this combination that caught the attention of Meyer Lansky. Mick Ricci was not just a boy from Dorchester. He was the blueprint of a man who could rise inside the most disciplined, ruthless, and politically entangled criminal machine America had ever seen. Boston, early 1950s. The city was changing. War veterans returned, neighborhoods shifted, and the old Irish and Italian strongholds of organized crime solidified control over gambling, loan sharking, and union influence. In the shadows of politics and industry, Ricci began his ascent. His first roles were small: collections, enforcement, running errands, but he approached them with a discipline rare among young recruits, a man delivering a threat with precision who could read reactions before words were spoken. Soon, Ricci was trusted with bigger tasks, supervising numbers operations, managing crews of men barely older than him, keeping accounts immaculate, ensuring silence. It was through these operations that Meyer Lansky's attention turned toward him. By the mid-1950s, Lansky was expanding his influence along the East Coast, using trusted lieutenants to oversee gambling syndicates far from New York. Boston was fertile ground, politically complex, tightly controlled, and lucrative. Ricci, already known for his quiet efficiency and strategic mind, became the linchpin for Lansky's ambitions in the city. Ricci's rise was methodical. He cultivated loyalty through rewards and fear in equal measure. Subordinates who performed were promoted. Betrayal was met swiftly. In every meeting, every handoff of cash, every whispered instruction, he displayed an understanding of hierarchy. The crew was a machine, and he was the operator. By the late 1960s, Ricci controlled the city's largest syndicate crew, overseeing gambling dens, casinos, and the underground lottery. Political connections were nurtured discreetly. City council members, local judges, even police precinct captains, men who could be guided with subtle pressure or quiet incentives. These relationships were crucial, ensuring operations continued without interference, while competitors underestimated Ricci's influence.
It was not brute force alone that elevated him. It was patience, intelligence, and perception of opportunity. Ricci understood that a syndicate could survive only if it mirrored the society it existed in, hierarchical, disciplined, and politically aware. Yet, with power came exposure. As Ricci's crew expanded, so too did rivalries, both within the city and beyond. Ambitions collided, loyalties frayed, and in the shadows of his own empire, seeds of betrayal, planted by forces as old as Lansky himself, were beginning to stir. By 1970, Ricci was not just a lieutenant, he was a force, a man who controlled Boston's underworld while keeping Lansky's empire humming. But even as his influence peaked, the ledger that would end him, the one connecting politics to illicit gain, was quietly circulating, unseen by all but the wrong eyes. Boston, 1972. The city pulsed with unrest, labor strikes, political corruption scandals, and the lingering shadow of organized crime. Ricci had reached the pinnacle of his influence. He controlled numbers, casinos, unions, and even a few politicians who owed him favors. Yet it was precisely this control that made him vulnerable. The turning point came quietly. A rival crew in Charlestown, seeking to expand their territory, began encroaching on Ricci's operations. At first, these were small provocations. Delayed payments, subtle threats, whispered rumors of disloyalty within his ranks. Ricci responded with calculated pressure, asserting dominance without open violence. But the balance he maintained was delicate. One misstep could unravel 20 years of meticulous control. Complicating matters was Lansky himself. The aging boss was no longer content with loyalty alone. He demanded absolute discretion. Any risk, political exposure, excessive visibility, internal disputes, was intolerable. Ricci had grown too visible, too ambitious, too influential. The ledger, the financial record connecting Boston's politicians to mob-controlled gambling profits, began circulating in quiet circles. It was a mistake waiting to happen, and Lansky's keen eyes recognized the danger. Meanwhile, Ricci faced internal tensions. Subordinates who had once deferred to him now tested limits, emboldened by promises from rival factions. Decisions he had made without question now sparked resentment. Even allies whispered doubts behind closed doors. Ricci was no longer untouchable. He was isolated at the top, a commander in a castle with unseen enemies at every gate. By 1974, subtle cracks became undeniable. Key political allies grew cautious, police oversight tightened, rivals plotted. And Ricci, who had once controlled the rhythm of Boston's underworld, now had to navigate a labyrinth of threats he could neither fully see nor entirely control. The turning point was not a single act of violence. It was recognition. Power alone could not guarantee survival. And in that realization lay both his greatest strength and his ultimate vulnerability, a vulnerability Lansky would exploit with lethal precision.
Boston, 1975. The city's political landscape was a chessboard. City council seats, state legislators, and precinct captains were pawns, and Ricci had spent decades learning how to move them. But power at this level was no longer simple. Every favor owed, every bribe exchanged, and every law enforcement connection became a potential liability. Ricci's operations intersected with politics more openly than ever. Licenses for gambling dens, permits for construction projects tied to union contracts, even zoning approvals, all funneled influence back to him. He had cultivated relationships with aldermen and councilmen, men who could tip the balance of a vote or close an investigation with a whispered call. But the ledger, the very document that cataloged these political entanglements, was circulating beyond Ricci's control. Staffers, accountants, even minor politicians had glimpsed it. Word of its existence spread quietly through City Hall, reaching ears that Lansky had long trained to listen. By 1976, pressure mounted from two directions. Rivals within Boston saw opportunity: take out Ricci and claim his operations, or leverage the ledger for political gain. Simultaneously, federal and state authorities, spurred by anonymous tips, began investigating irregularities in gambling licenses and campaign financing. Ricci was forced to negotiate, intimidate, and bribe with greater care,
yet every move left traces. The political escalation was subtle but merciless. Meetings in smoke-filled offices, envelopes exchanged in public garages, phone calls routed through intermediaries, all became a dangerous game of exposure. Ricci had survived the streets, but now the battlefield was halls of power and corridors of governance. Even Lansky's patience was tested. He saw Ricci's brilliance, but he also recognized that the man who controlled Boston's largest syndicate crew had become a liability. Politics and crime had always danced a delicate waltz, but Ricci's steps had made the steps perilous. One wrong turn, and the empire he built could collapse, leaving him exposed. The city's power networks tightened like a noose. Ricci was at the apex of influence, but influence alone was no shield against betrayal, orchestrated in shadows by the very man who had placed him there. Boston, 1976. The streets had grown quieter in some neighborhoods, but inside Ricci's crew, unease festered like a hidden infection. Men he had trusted for decades began drifting, influenced by whispers and promises from rival factions. Loyalty, once absolute, was now transactional. Ricci had always been cautious, but power had a way of magnifying suspicion. Every meeting, every handshake was now a calculated risk. Even his most loyal lieutenants were tested by fear, ambition, or the subtle lure of Lansky's ultimate judgment. One wrong word, one misinterpreted glance, and alliances could shift instantly.
The ledger remained the unspoken thread. It documented everything: payoffs to city councilmen, subtle manipulations of unions, the flow of gambling profits. Ricci had once guarded it meticulously. Now, fragments had begun leaking. Staffers, accountants, and even minor politicians had glimpsed its contents. The exposure was slow, almost imperceptible, but the consequences would be immediate. Lansky, ever the strategist, had grown wary. Ricci's brilliance was undeniable, but so too was his visibility. A man who could command Boston's underworld for 20 years was now a liability to a national empire. Rumors circulated of surveillance, whispers of discussions in Miami offices, and quiet warnings delivered through intermediaries. Ricci's isolation became psychological as well as operational. Decisions he had once taken with certainty were now second-guessed. Paranoia seeped into daily routines. He noticed men who once laughed at his jokes avoiding eye contact. Phone calls that once carried business now carried caution. And yet Ricci continued. He could not step down, not when ambition, loyalty, and survival were intertwined so tightly. But the closer he clung to power, the tighter the web of betrayal became. In the shadows, Lansky orchestrated the next move. The ledger, once a tool of leverage, had become a blueprint for execution. By the end of 1976, Ricci stood alone at the summit of his empire. Surrounded by allies, yet unseen enemies multiplied. The stage was set. The trap was ready. February 12, 1977. Dorchester. The streets were slick with winter rain. A black sedan waited in the shadows near a narrow brick row house. Every detail had been planned, every variable considered. Mick Ricci walked out into the cold night, unaware that Lansky's decision, executed through trusted intermediaries, had sealed his fate. He carried nothing of consequence except the awareness that politics and power had grown dangerously close. Inside the sedan, a driver idle, engine low. Across the street, a second vehicle watched the approach. Ricci paused to check his surroundings. Shadows moved where no one should be. Instinct told him caution, but years of command had taught trust in certain routines. Tonight, routine would betray him. A single shot shattered the quiet. Ricci collapsed, body hitting wet asphalt. The precision of the attack left no room for error. Witnesses would later recall only a blur. A man, a flash, the echo of a shot. The ledger, the web of political entanglements, the decades of dominance, all ended in a single moment. Lansky's orchestration was meticulous. No open warfare, no public spectacle, just a calculated removal of a liability. Within hours, Boston's underworld understood. Even the most loyal, most competent, most untouchable operators were expendable when the stakes rose too high.
The execution did more than eliminate Ricci. It sent a signal. Loyalty had limits. Power had boundaries. Even brilliance could not shield one from the consequences of exposure in an empire built on discretion, fear, and leverage. By morning, Ricci was gone. His body would be discovered later in an alley, an unremarkable death in an unremarkable neighborhood. But the reverberations, the fear, the shift in alliances, the scramble for control would last for years. Lansky had silenced the man who had run his largest syndicate crew for 2 decades,
And in doing so, he had reminded the underworld that no empire, however well managed, was immune to the cold calculus of survival. Boston, 1977. The city awoke to a quiet storm. Mick Ricci was gone, but the ripples of his disappearance spread far beyond Dorchester streets. Within the underworld, uncertainty replaced order. The crew he had commanded for 2 decades fractured almost instantly. Men who once followed without question now jockeyed for position, some seeking control, others seeking distance from the growing chaos. The political consequences were subtle but powerful. Councilmen and city officials who had once been discreetly guided by Ricci's influence now found themselves vulnerable. The ledger, its existence whispered in city hall corridors, became a silent threat. Any misstep could unravel careers, expose payoffs, or provoke law enforcement scrutiny. Boston's carefully managed criminal political ecosystem began to wobble. Rival syndicates smelled opportunity. Smaller crews made tentative moves to claim territory. Allies of Ricci hesitated, unsure of who now held power or favor. Loyalties that had seemed unshakable dissolved under fear. The city's underworld was suddenly a battlefield of uncertainty. Even within Lansky's broader empire, the decision resonated. Ricci had been a linchpin, a stabilizing force connecting Boston to the national syndicate network. His absence required rapid recalibration. Communication channels tightened, operations were reorganized, and Lansky's men watched Boston like hawks, ensuring no rival could exploit the vacuum. Publicly, Ricci's death was barely noticed. A quiet corner of Boston's news cycle mentioned an unidentified man shot, and the city moved on. Privately, fear and speculation ran rampant. The crew learned the harshest lesson of all. In organized crime, brilliance, loyalty, and decades of service were never enough. The aftermath of Ricci's death proved that power was ephemeral. Empires could collapse overnight, not from brute force alone, but from exposure, betrayal, and the unrelenting calculus of those who orchestrated the shadows. And in Boston, the streets whispered a new cautionary tale. Survival was never guaranteed, even for those who had once seemed untouchable. Power is a fragile architecture built on obedience, fear, and secrecy. Mick Ricci understood this better than most. For 20 years, he had walked the razor's edge, controlling men, manipulating politics, commanding loyalty. Yet in the end, even mastery was no shield against inevitability.
His story reveals the paradox at the heart of organized crime. Brilliance and discipline can elevate a man to the apex of influence, but the same qualities make him a threat to those who demand absolute control. Lansky's empire survived because it was willing to sever what it could not risk preserving. Loyalty, once sacred, became transactional. Trust, once a bond, became a liability. In Boston, Ricci's absence reshaped the underworld. Men who had looked to him for guidance scrambled to redefine alliances. Politicians adjusted their calculations. The ledger, the simple record of transactions, outlived him, a silent testament to the intersections of crime and power. The city's streets returned to their rhythm, but shadows lingered. Every whisper, every glance, every deal carried the memory of Ricci's rise and fall. His life and death were a mirror, reflecting the eternal cycle of ambition, exposure, and eradication that governs clandestine empires. In the quiet of Dorchester, one can still imagine Ricci walking those streets, calculating, patient, invincible in his own mind. But reality intrudes. Even the most disciplined operator cannot escape the calculus of survival when power collides with politics, secrecy, and human ambition. Ricci's story returns to its opening night. A single gunshot, a black sedan, the ledger, and a man silenced. It reminds us that in the world of organized crime, control is always provisional, loyalty always conditional, and even legends are mortal. And perhaps in that inevitability, there is the truest lesson. Power is not a crown to be worn. It is a shadow that will ultimately consume the one who dares to wield it.